Let's talk about getting lost. Has anybody ever been lost before? Have you ever been lost as a kid in the mall from your parents, or gotten lost hiking, taken the wrong trail, or been lost in your car, or been with somebody who's gotten lost in their car? Anybody directionally challenged here this morning? Well, one of the things I wanted to do this morning is kind of use this analogy of how we get lost and how we get found to kind of help some and put together all these three graces that we've been talking about. We've been talking about these big words, prevenient grace, and another word, justifying grace, and then sanctifying grace. And so to kind of put this all together, I wanted to kind of use the analogy of how we get lost and how we get found and how we get back home. That type of analogy. So they've actually studied human behavior, and we all have the ability to get lost. We all, as one of our hymns say, we are prone to wander. We are prone to get ourselves lost. And the first thing that we do, the first thing that happens that gets us lost is we make a navigational mistake. We take a wrong turn, we go in a wrong direction. Spiritually, what's happening is whenever we make a decision to turn away from God, like Adam and Eve in the garden, they chose the forbidden fruit, and when they did that, that was a navigational mistake. They were moving away from God. They were going in a direction in their lives away from God, and so that was their navigational mistake. And you and I spiritually make navigational mistakes that do things and decisions and behaviors that take us away from God, and that's the first stage of being lost. Do you know you're lost when you do that? No. You know, if you've made a navigational error in your car, you're not lost, right? You haven't taken a wrong. You're not even aware of it, and you're not admitting it. And that actually enters into the second phase. The second phase is called the gray period. Now, this period, and they've studied this with people, human behavior, when people get lost in the wilderness, they enter this, what's called the gray period. And during the gray period, what's happening is people are only paying attention to the things or the cues in nature that tell them they're right and going in the right direction, even though they're lost and going the wrong direction. So they're only paying attention to the things that say, I'm right. Now, do you know anybody like that? Have you ever been in a car when somebody's lost at the wheel? You know they're lost, and you're telling them that they're lost, but they're going, I'm not lost. You know it, but they're not willing to admit it. They're still saying, I know I'm going in the right direction. It's like the guy who was out hiking in New Zealand, and he was lost in the wilderness, and he said to himself, I was amazed at how the sun came up in the west instead of the east in New Zealand. You see, by human nature, we only pay attention to the things that tell us we're not lost, that we don't need God, that I'm going the right direction, that I've got it all figured out. And that's what leads us to getting more lost and further away from God, because we're only paying attention to the cues that tell us we're right and everybody else is wrong. Then the third phase is panic. You realize you're lost. You've gone the wrong direction. You figure out, and when a person is lost in the wilderness, their blood pressure goes up, their heart rate goes up, they panic, they realize they're lost, they admit that, oh my gosh, I've made a mistake. And then that's actually the first step, though, isn't it? To discovering that you need to be found. And so the only way you'll ever be found is to admit that you're lost and that you've got to figure out how to get back. And so until that point, you're only becoming more and more lost, and so we're moving more and more away from God until that moment comes, like we heard in last week's sermon about the prodigal son. He came to his senses, it says in the text. He realized he had gotten too far from home. He had gotten away from his family and his father, and he needed to return home. He admitted he was lost. He admitted to himself that he had come to his senses and needed to head back in the direction of home. And I think those are those moments in our lives where we realize, I've gotten far away from God. I'm not, as one fellow member said, I'm not where I intended to be. I'm never lost. It's just not where I intended to be. And that's really what we talked about being lost the first week, was being in the wrong place, not where God intended for us to be. And so we admit that. Now, if you're lost in your car, for example, and you know you're going in the wrong direction, what do? You get on Google Maps. No, yeah. What was that, Paul? That's right, Paul. Paul's got it. we turn around, right? We make a U-turn at the next intersection and we get going back in the right direction. That's actually what is going on here in this diagram. We make a U-turn back towards God. We change our life's orientation back to God spiritually. And that's called repentance. That's that moment where our hearts make a 180-degree reorientation back to God. And because we've admitted we lost, and then guess what happens? We become found. Now, it's interesting because when humans get lost in the wilderness, they try different strategies to try and get back. One of the strategies they try is what's called route sampling. So they'll stand at an intersection, a pathway, and they'll try this path for 15 minutes, come back, this path for 15 minutes, come back, this path for 15 minutes, come back, and then they'll try and get a sense of where they are. A better strategy for some people is to actually climb up a tree, go up to a higher ground, and kind of get a lay of the land and try and make a decision as to what the best direction to go is. Another strategy that some people take that is not a good strategy is they stubbornly say, I'm going to go this direction, and I'm just going to keep going this direction until I hit civilization, not realizing that they've made another wrong choice, and they become more lost because of their stubbornness not to be aware that they are getting more lost. And so they stubbornly say, all right, I'm going to just go in this direction, and I'm going to keep going until I find civilization, and sometimes that doesn't work. You know what the best strategy for getting found is if you're lost in the wilderness? Stay put, right. You guys have been lost in the wilderness before, right? Yeah, that's good. But think about this from a spiritual perspective. God said, be still and know that I am God. A lot of times we try and figure it out ourselves. We're trying to come up with our own strategy to how to get our way back to God, and we try all these different routes or behaviors or pathways or whatever it is, when God says, just stay put and allow my grace to find you. If you're lost, my grace will come to you and find you and will lead you home. And so we're found by God's grace when we stay put, when we stop running, when we stop going in the wrong direction, that we turn around and we face God and say, God, come find me. I'm lost. God's grace shows up. And then what God's grace leads us back home. Just like if somebody were to find us lost in the wilderness, if the search team would come, what would they do? They would guide us back home. They would guide us along the right path. Christ came into the world to show us the way back to God. To live and follow Christ is to be guided back home to God. And so that's what we do as disciples. Now, so to put this all together, these are the three graces at work in our lives. Let's take a look at this. So when we're leaving God, when we're running away from God, after we've made that navigational mistake, and maybe we're not even admitting we're lost, we don't even want to admit we're lost, God's grace is still there for us. God's grace is still available to us. That moment we take a U-turn and reorient our lives back to God, that's justifying grace. That's the grace of God that says you're forgiven. My grace is real to you. You are welcome back home. You are welcome into the kingdom. And then sanctifying grace is the grace that's at work in our lives that's leading us back to where God intended us to be the people that God intended us to be. Now God said to us this tough thing. God said, be holy as I am holy. So this is the tough part because this really gets us to this idea of sanctification. So sanctification or sanctifying grace is the process of being made holy. How many people want to know God's will for your life this morning? How many people would love to know that, right? You were actually already told that in the scripture this morning. Did you hear it? We all were told this. Philippians 4:3 says this, for this is the will of God, your sanctification, my sanctification. God's will for our lives is that we be made holy. Now, I don't know about you, but that's kind of, we don't like the word. We don't go around using that holy word too much, do we? We don't go around talking around, hey, I'm more holy today than I was yesterday. Isn't that great? I don't go around talking about, hey, are you sanctified? Am I sanctified? We don't walk up. That's not part of our conversation because these are words that feel a little maybe negative to us. This whole idea of holiness. Now, sanctification is what I would call a grace-filled process of becoming holy. But this word holiness kind of hangs us up sometimes because when we think of the word holy, what are the negative connotations that we think about? Say some phrases that you think of when I say the word holy. Holy roller, holier than thou. Any other holies? Holy moly. Yeah, that's right. Holy cow. That's right. That's right. So we have these things. So this process of becoming holy is something that we're not used to talking about or thinking about. It's not exactly what we might think about, because we think of holiness maybe as perfection or doing all the right behaviors or doing all the things, and that's not necessarily holiness. The best way to describe being holy is something's holy when it's set aside for God's purposes. So when we set something aside for God's purposes, it's holy. It's made holy. And when we set ourselves aside for God's purposes and God's work in our lives, we're in the process of being made holy. So it's not so much about piety and being a holy roller or holier than thou. It's about another process. So 2 parts to this process Romans talks about this morning. The first part of this process is the process of dying to sin. That's what Paul said. That when we're justifying grace, when we're justified, that's a big word for saying that we're forgiven for our sin. Sanctification or sanctifying grace is the work that goes on within us to subdue our sin. Because we all wrestle with it. Have you ever had that time where you know that there's something you're doing that you shouldn't be doing, and for some reason you just keep doing it? That's the way Paul put it. He says, for some reason I just keep doing it. And that's part of that wrestling that we do in this process to subdue those things in our lives that we have to die to. Romans 6, chapter 6, 10, 11 says this, talking about Christ. The death he died to sin once for all. That's good news. Christ has died forgiven. We're forgiven for all the sin in our lives. But the life he lives to God. So you also must consider yourselves dead to sin and alive to God in Christ Jesus. So part of this process is the willingness on our part to put to death those behaviors that we know are pulling us away from God and further away from God, and start to look at those behaviors in our life that will draw us towards God and living for God and setting aside ourselves for God's purposes. The good news in the whole thing about sanctifying grace is that God's grace is there. So even if I don't get it right, even if I mess up or make a mistake, God's grace is still there to get us back up on our feet again and keep moving in the right direction. So if we're going back to God and we stumble, we fall on the path back to God, Christ is right there with God's grace to pick us back up again and get us moving again. A great example of this is actually a fighter pilot who went up in his plane, and there was a mechanical failure in his plane, and he had to eject from the plane. Plane crashed. So the pilot, they did an investigation of the crash, and they found out that it was a human error. The mechanic who had worked on the plane before it took off had forgotten to connect something in the plane's engine. So don't ask me about the details of this. I don't know anything about jets. But he forgot to do something. And so after the investigation and they discovered this human error, the pilot wanted to see the mechanic that worked on his plane. I don't know about you, but I would not want to be a part of that discussion. So the mechanic avoided, and finally the mechanic caught up with him and said, I want to talk to you. And he says, I know, I messed up. It was my fault. I am so sorry that I made this mistake. I realize this almost cost your life. I've been feeling horrible about this ever since it happened. And the pilot looked at him and said, I forgive you. And then he said to him, that's why I want you to be working on my plane from now on. Why did he do that? One, he extended grace. But the other thing he knew is that he saw this man's heart, and he knew that this man was going to take care of him. He was going to have his back from now on. He was giving him a second chance, and that second chance was also encouraging loyalty in that mechanic. And that's the same way God's grace works in us, that God says to us, I forgive you. It's okay. I want you working for me now, though. I want your response to be, you've got my back. You're working for me now. You're setting your life aside for my purposes, to be holy, to be set aside for God's purpose. And that's God's grace at work in us. So even if we stumble, fall, make a mistake, God's grace is still there, getting us back up again, moving in the right direction, calling us to live for God. And that's the second part of the process. So it's not just about figuring out the behaviors I have to stop doing, but it's also about what are the behaviors and things that God is asking me to do. What are the life-giving behaviors? Well, how can I live for God? How can I live for God's purposes? That's the other part of the process. It's interesting because a lot of people think of this process as kind of like a negative process because it is partly dying to sin, and some have made it a process by which it's more legalistic, or made holiness about following a set of rules, or made holiness about being better than other people, and so that creates judgmentalism. So legalism is, as long as I follow these rules, I'm okay with God. Well, that's not grace. The other part of it is that, my behavior is better than so-and-so's behavior, so I must be better than them, and they're not a good Christian or a good person or whatever I want to evaluate, and so I'm comparing, and that's judgmentalism. Holiness and sanctification is not about either of those things. Paul actually describes it in Thessalonians. He says, he's actually talking about sexual behavior, and we won't go into that this morning, but he's actually saying, how is this behavior honoring God and honoring other people? Whatever the behavior is, does it honor God? Does it help us to love God? And does it help us to honor and love other people? That's Paul's criteria. So an example of this was actually just a couple weeks ago. I was at a wedding, and I was a pastor at the wedding and did the ceremony. And afterwards, I was at the reception and talking to some folks, and there was a guy there I hadn't seen for years and years and years. And I went up to him and say hello, and he it was what I call a biker dude. You know, he's not like I'm a cyclist. He's a biker. That's the difference. So a cyclist rides a bicycle with pedals. A biker rides a motorized version of that, and it goes faster and louder than my bike. So he's a biker, and so he looks like a biker, but he's got tattoos up and down his arm and on his neck, and he's got a lot of tattoos. And I was up there talking to him, and I noticed he had a cross tattooed on his hand right here. And it actually reminded me of something, and so I asked him, I said, so I see you got a cross on your hand. And it was like he tried to cover it up. He was kind of embarrassed that he had tattoos, and here he is talking to a pastor, and then he goes into, well, I haven't been to church in a long time, and I'm like, I'm not asking about that. I'm just asking where you got the tattoo. And then he began to get I could tell he was uncomfortable talking about it because he had felt judged. Not by me, but it turned out that he wasn't going to church anymore because the people where he had gone to church and his wife went to church had judged him because he had tattoos. And they had said to him, you shouldn't have a tattoo. And so he felt judged. And he actually mentioned, I know there's a verse in Leviticus, which there's a lot of verses in Leviticus. There's only one verse in the whole entire Bible that says you shouldn't get a tattoo. And it basically says, don't get a tattoo. I mean, that's Poole's paraphrase version, all right? But it's one verse in what's called the Holiness Code, or the Levitical Code, which is about, these are all the things you do and don't do to be holy people. Now, it's interesting because this is where I think Paul's application comes in handy, and I'm going to explain this. So you still with me this morning so far? So here's not really, I got you. You just stay with me. You'll catch up later. Don't worry, I'll be back. So, gotta love it. Love what kids say. All right. Where was I anyway? So, okay, we'll get there. All right. So, we've got this criteria: love God, love others. So when Leviticus was written, the reason that they told the Israelites, do not get a tattoo, is because in that time period, in that context, tattooing was associated and a part of spiritual worship of other gods. So a person would get a tattoo as a part of worshiping a god other than the God, Jehovah. And so the Israelites were commanded, don't get a tattoo because that's worshiping another god. So the reason that code was written was to, honor God and honor other people, because you wouldn't want to communicate to other people that you don't know the God of the universe, that you're worshiping some other God. And so it was an attempt to love God and love others, to honor God and honor others. And what's one of the first commandments in the Bible? Love the Lord your God and have no other gods before God, right? So that was part of how they held up that thing. that criteria. What I mentioned to this gentleman was, when I was in Egypt, and I've mentioned this before, the Christians in Egypt tattoo a cross on their hand in the exact same spot that this gentleman had his tattoo. And when I asked the Egyptian Christians why they tattooed their hands with the cross, they said, because we live in a Muslim country and we cannot speak the name of Christ. We cannot tell others that we're Christians. And it's because we can't verbally speak it, otherwise we would be persecuted and even killed. So we tattoo the cross on our hands so that whenever we serve someone, they see that we're a Christian. Whenever we pay someone at a cash register, they see that we're a Christian. What were the Egyptians attempting to do with their tattoo? They were seeking to honor God and honor other people. So here's the thing, same behavior, tattoos, in two different contexts, in two different time periods, in two different cultures. But the criteria of why they were doing it is the same, is it not? The Israelites in Leviticus were trying to honor God and love and honor others. And the Egyptian Christians were trying to honor God and honor others. And as I talked to this gentleman who had felt judged in his church, and I explained some of this to him, I think he felt a little bit better. Because the reason he got that too is because it meant something to him and meant something about his relationship to God. And that's why it was important to him. So it wasn't about the fact that he had a tattoo, it was what it meant to him in his relationship to God that was important. Which is really what God's hoping for us in being sanctified. Is it helping us to love God more? Is it helping us to love others more? Paul actually wrote in Thessalonians that we would be sanctified or holy, and he uses the phrase a couple times, more and more, which indicates it's a process. It's a lifelong process. We don't ever arrive at one point where we're just, we wake up one day and all of a sudden we're holy. It's a lifelong process, and the best way I can describe it is it's a process whereby it's kind of like a very slow heart transplant, where God is taking our heart that's been self-centered and selfish and replacing it with a heart that is more full and directed at loving God and being devoted to God and loving other people as a result. So God is wanting to transform our hearts in that way. John Wesley actually called people to what Love at Weems calls true holiness of heart and life, which for Wesley meant, am I more loving and devoted to God today than I was yesterday? Am I more loving and devoted to other people today more so than I was yesterday? The more and more. That's a process. And that's the question for us, isn't it? Are we more and more devoted to God today than we were yesterday? Are we more and more loving towards other people today than we were yesterday? If the answer is yes, then we're experiencing the sanctifying grace of God at work in us. If the answer is no, then maybe it's time for a U-turn. Maybe it's time to admit that you're lost. And it's time to head home. And God's grace will lead you there. Amen.